have to break down limestone. You break it down and you burn it for several days on end at really, really high temperatures. So it requires kilns actually to make lime plaster. You have to burn this limestone at about 600 to 900 degrees. So this is a very specialized process and very technologically advanced. And so we see this lime plaster used in a number of interesting ways at Ayin Ghazal. One of them is in the creation of these really interesting statues that were found there. There are about 32 of these statues found at Ayin Ghazal. They appear to be both male and female. And there are two types. There's one which is sort of a full body figure, and another which is more of a bust or a torso. These are actually formed by molding plaster over an internal framework of reeds that were then wrapped with twine, and now all that organic material, of course, is disintegrated. But we can see, the impressions that they left in the plaster. The facial features were formed using simple tools, and again, the use of these, we again are lost for the real sense of what they are. Is it a form of ancestor worship? Are these gods or divinities who are being made? Especially these two-headed sort of beings. Are these couples? Are they offerings to the gods? Well, again, we don't know, but what I will point out to you and keep in mind are these eyes. The emphasis again on eyes looking forward, this forward gaze, and just very, very clearly defined eyes. These eyes are actually painted and accentuated with black paste that makes them stand out, and that's something that we're going to see over and over and over again. So just keep this in mind as we move forward. The shift to this technology, being able to create these lime plaster figures, and actually this lime plaster can be used to make vessels. It's a type of pottery, a proto-pottery, if you will, known as whiteware. This is an example of it here from El Kaun, Syria. It's not pottery because it's not being fired, it's just drying in the sun, but you can really see how this technology would lead to the development of real pottery, pottery which is clay fired intentionally so that it hardens and becomes ceramic. And this invention of pottery is actually the final stage of the Neolithic Revolution, and it marks a major stage in the development of civilization, according to many. The process of firing clay and then later glazing, it requires a number of different techniques, and we're going to see these techniques develop over time. At this time, two types are being primarily used, paddling and coiling. You can see here clay being formed into a bowl using a paddling technique, a stone and then a paddle to form it, or coiling, right, in which you would just coil a pot. Later on, we're going to see the introduction of the slow wheel, which is used just by turning and then forming the bowl or vessel with one hand, and then much later the fast wheel, which actually uses centrifugal motion. Those of you who've seen the Patrick Swayze movie Ghost, that's a fast wheel. Wow, I just dated myself terribly. You guys probably never saw that film. Anyway, so we're going to see these technologies developing, but pottery itself, this technology, comes from these early experiments at places like Ayin Ghazal, and it's a major shift. Pottery does a lot for us. Pottery, the desire for it could be, what can you do with pottery? What does pottery allow you to do? Now that we have these pots. They're not really ideally suited to travel because they break easily, but certainly in a sedentary setting. Now we're in one place. We have pots. Yeah. Right. So okay, you can carry liquid. That's fantastic, right? So now you can store liquid. You can also store grain. It produces a great way of storing grain. Before this grain, there were storage facilities at, for example, some of these Natufian sites. But they were really just sort of earthen bins to keep out pests. But pottery is great for storage because it keeps out mice, it keeps out rodents. What else does it allow you to do? Yeah?
Fermentation. If they make beer, for example, much safer way of drinking it compared to water, contaminated water.
we're gonna talk about beer quite a bit, and wine. In fact, yeah, this is exactly when we do see fermentation. The ability to use liquids, picking up on what you said, fermentation, cooking, right? Now you can cook. And so that allows you to access a whole bunch of different food sources that before you didn't have access to. Now you have starches and things that you can cook and turn into usable food. Fermentation, though, is really great, and actually there's some theories out there that fermentation was the whole reason that this occurred in the first place. And at this time, we do have evidence around 5,100 BC at this place called Gönen Tepe. There's evidence of tartaric acid, which is the residue from beer and wine on the insides of these vessels. So it seems as though this desire for beer or this desire for wine did actually have quite a bit to do with some of these developments. And there are health reasons for that too, not just because of the alcohol, but for other reasons too, as we'll talk about. We're going to see beer showing up in medical texts. It's very interesting stuff, which we're going to get to. So fermentation definitely as well. It has a huge cultural impact. This ability now to create objects in this plastic form, this creative process really leaves a permanent mark on societies and doesn't leave. We're going to be looking at a lot of pottery. Pottery, of course, is privileged in the archaeological record because we have it, right? It survives. But that's not to say it doesn't have an intimate relationship with human beings, right? We talk about pottery in a way that is very much akin to the body. Those of you who might have had potters, we talk about the shoulder of the vessel, the belly or the foot, as though these are sort of anthropomorphic objects. A lot of our early creation stories in many different cultures recount beings being formed from clay and having life being breathed into them. So pottery is very important. Not just for the cultures, but also the stylistic shift in pottery, as we talked about last time, gives us a chronological sort of progression of cultures. We can find pottery in a certain style, and by style we mean a set of attributes that are either intentional or subconscious, that reflect the culture or the identity of the artist. We find these changes in pottery styles over time allow us to get a sense of when a particular context might be, right? So using pottery, like we talked about last time, to establish chronologies. So again, pottery can't say enough about it. It's very useful for us and also in the past too. That said, we still have to be very careful because, like the Kabaran culture, which is defined just by the cave in which it was first discovered, oftentimes we're going to see, for example, on Wednesday, entire cultures that are defined just by their specific type of pottery. Pottery is important, but it's not everything. Pots are not people, and we can't associate groups of people just on the basis of their, single material culture. I drive a Toyota. Because I drive a Toyota, it doesn't make me Japanese, right? So that's the point we have to keep in mind. In the remaining time, we're going to shift out of the pre-pottery Neolithic. We're going to start with the transition to the pottery Neolithic around 7,000 BC. So the final site we're going to look at is a very, very interesting site, which many of you might have heard of before. It's Çatalhöyük. And Çatalhöyük, as you can see, is here in Anatolia. And it dates, it's actually a very, very long inhabited site. But the period we're going to be looking at is about 6,850 to 6,300, right at the end of the PPNB and the beginning of the pottery Neolithic. This transition, again, we're going to see a shift. This site is over 12 hectares. Remember, Jericho, preceding it, was only 10 hectares. So these sites are expanding and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We're talking about an estimated population of anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 people. And the use of pottery is found at every single site, every single level of occupation at the site. It's still being excavated. The land around it is very swampy. It's not ideal for agriculture, so it's possible that crops were actually cultivated elsewhere, and that this site might have acted as a ceremonial center given the high degree of decoration and all of the material culture found there. It was excavated by James Mellart in 1961 to 65. Now there's a team of Brits from Cambridge working on it. Ruth Tringham here at Berkeley works on it. Ian Hodder is also a principal investigator at that site. The site is a tell. We talked about tell, that layer cake, a human mound of habitation. And it's actually 17.5 meters of occupation. That's a huge amount, about 70 feet, or actually, I'm sorry, 17 meters above the plane and then 5 below, so about 22 meters of human occupation, just city upon city upon city upon city, 13 levels in all. When we start talking about these particular levels in this layer cake, when we excavate a site, we start at 1, right? Because you're excavating, you don't know what you're going to find underneath. Maybe you're going to find 3 cities, maybe you're going to find 10 cities. So you start at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. So 13 is really, really far down. Just so that's clear, right? So when we say level 13, it's actually much earlier than, say, level 5. Does that make sense? So it's sort of a little counterintuitive, but it has to do with the way these sites are excavated. So the site, the levels we're going to be looking at Catalhoek are actually levels 2 through level 8, and these date to the period that we're looking at, this pottery Neolithic. And you can see here what looks to be a city plan. Regular rectilinear houses built right up against one another with these small, narrow alleyways snaking their way between them. General continuity in the types of architecture. These houses or these units have a number of the same features. It almost looks like a city block. We have regular open spaces. You can see these courtyards, which are spaced regularly throughout the settlement. And again, we should say only 1/3 of this site has actually been excavated. There's a tremendous amount that we don't know about this site. But at least in this neighborhood or this, ceremonial center that's been excavated, we find what seem to be a number of domestic spaces. The buildings themselves were built of mold-made bricks and wood frameworks. The floors and walls inside were plastered, in some cases over 100 different times. And so if this is done annually, every year you would replaster the floors, replaster the walls. You get a sense of how long the site was inhabited, as hundreds and hundreds of years before the city might be torn down or a building might be torn down and another one built on top of it. The houses themselves are about 25 square meters in size, and were thought to hold a single family unit. Again, the entire amount of which this is just a part, we think that there are probably over 1,000 of these different homes there. See if I can get a close-up here. The buildings themselves are very interesting in the sense that they don't have doors. It seems as though the buildings were accessed through the roof, and a number of them, especially on the outside, seem to share a common wall. And this might have been done for defensive purposes, just like at Jericho, where we saw this big defensive wall to separate, those who are inside and those who are outside. This idea of personal property and space seems to be also at Catalhoek, with ladders being used to access certain places, and this outer wall to keep people out. We find